Hello. Welcome to the Trails Breakout Session for DCNR's Community Conservation Partnership Program. My name is Alex MacDonald. I am the Section Chief for the Trails, Greenways, and Statewide Planning section. I'm one of 4 staff members within this section. The other 3 members are Leslie Sarvis, Greenways and Trail Specialist, Kristen Ziegler, Recreation and Conservation Advisor, Stephanie Dressler, Recreation and Conservation Advisor. During this year's Trail Breakout Session, we will start by reviewing the criteria for being considered a trail project under our grant program. After that, we will go through the general evolution of trails from concept to trail construction and how our grants fit into those phases. Then we will go into a bit more detail about motorized recreation projects, discuss accessibility, and lastly, we will provide more detail on the various funding sources available for trail projects. You can visit the DCNR website, www.dcnr.pa.gov, click on Grants, and there you will find more information on trail grants. For trail acquisition projects, generally those projects will be focused on trail corridors or trail facilities, like trailheads. If your project involves acquiring a large block of land that has the potential for trail development, we would not consider that a trail project. Rather, that should apply under the Land Acquisition and Conservation Grant Opportunity. I'll stop here and highlight the importance of connecting with your regional advisor. They're there to help you determine what type of trail application you have and to help you get your application submitted under the proper grant opportunity. What we are looking at here is the typical process for establishing a trail. From the idea or concept to planning, where we typically analyze and assess the feasibility of a trail, to the acquisition of right-of-way, to engineering and design, and then finally to construction and development. Now we will talk about how our grant program can help with each of these stages. Let's start with trail planning, which is typically the first step after concept. Trail planning projects follow a public process to examine the feasibility of developing land trails and trail-related facilities for motorized and non-motorized recreational activities, and lay out an implementation plan to successfully move trail projects forward. How do you know if you should apply for a trail planning project? You should apply if you don't already have a plan. Most situations require planning in order to move from concept to implementation successfully. You need to determine the feasibility of a trail, meaning can the trail legally be constructed? And also questions like, is there an organization with the capacity to build and maintain the trail in the long term? You need to determine an alignment and acquire property, or you want to establish a trail network throughout your community or region. Now we'll discuss the types of trail planning projects that we typically fund. Generally, we refer to most planning efforts as trail studies. These involve some element of feasibility, public participation, conceptual designs, and implementation strategy. Also, we have trail network studies, which try to determine the feasibility of a trail network throughout a municipality or a county. Finally, we offer design only. Design only includes design and engineering work for projects that do not yet have construction funding secured. Should note here that DCNR does require pre-approval during the application stage to be eligible for a design-only project. This process begins by contacting your regional advisor. It is also important to note here in the planning section that DCNR does understand that not all planning projects fit into a standard template, which is why we provide flexibility in the scope of work for each planning effort. It is important to connect with your regional advisor to discuss your needs and how to best capture those in a scope of work for your project. Common issues with trail planning applications. Lack of community or municipal support. Either there is no support, or the letters haven't been uploaded, or those entities have not been contacted yet by the grantee. So that's something that should be addressed in the application. A lack of detailed scope of work and budget. You should have a detailed scope of work and budget, and they should be consistent with each other. For example, If the scope says there will be a public survey with your planning project, then there should be a budget item for a public survey. Are there scope of work items missing that should have been included? If you require title of ownership research as part of your plan, then it should be in the scope and in the budget. Selecting a consultant prior to grant award. Consultants who give estimates during the application stage can also submit proposals to complete the work after the grant has been awarded, but typically a consultant should not be chosen before a grant is awarded. Also, not reviewing a scope of work with your regional advisor. These are common issues that we see with trail planning applications. The next step in the trail development process is often the acquisition of right-of-way. Trail acquisition projects involve the purchase of fee simple title or perpetual easement to real property for subsequent development of motorized and non-motorized trails and trail-related facilities. How do you know if you should apply for a trail acquisition project? You should apply if you have an identified corridor and a willing seller. Also, your organization will own and manage the trail in perpetuity. Here are some things to consider before applying for a trail acquisition project. A DCNR covenant will be placed in the recorded deed or easement that states that these properties cannot be converted to other purposes other than those the property was originally acquired for. And also no change of use and no transfer of ownership, control, or interest in the property may occur, and that no encumbrances may be placed on the property without the written consent of DCNR. If there are structures on the property, they may not be eligible as part of the DCNR purchase, or if it is considered eligible, it will be subject to the DCNR covenant. DCNR does not fund condemnation by eminent domain. If this is your situation, discuss with your regional advisor to review alternatives that might be acceptable to DCNR. Here are a few common issues we see with trail acquisition applications. The appraisal does not meet DCNR standards or is missing. A full appraisal report must be completed by a licensed general real estate appraiser and uploaded with your application. Occasionally, the appraisal does not meet these guidelines, or the applicant did not order the appraisal early enough, therefore cannot upload with the application. A copy of the draft sales agreement or easement is missing, either because negotiations are still in the early stages or the owner has not yet agreed to sell. Written letters from the property owners for parcels being acquired are missing, often for the same reasons that the draft sales agreement are missing. The last step in the trail development process is actual trail development or construction. These are the projects that account for the bulk of trail applications. Trail development projects construct new and rehabilitate and maintain existing land trails and trail-related facilities for motorized and non-motorized recreational activities. How do you know if you should apply for a trail development project? You should apply if you need to construct new miles of trails or trail facilities, or you need to rehabilitate existing trails or trail facilities. You should apply if your project will help to close a priority trail gap, or will enhance the access to or the accessibility of an existing trail system, or trail facility. Things to consider before applying. Does the applicant have ownership or some type of control over the property to be developed? In some cases, DCNR can accept signed agreements between the owner and the grant applicant, but generally require that the applicant is the owner or has some type of control over the property. Has the applicant considered the appropriate accessibility standards, and are those factored into the budget and the scope of work? Is there demonstrated support for this project from the community and local governments? Here are a few common issues we see with trail development applications. First is not having ownership control at the time of application, or that the application fails to clearly explain that ownership and control is already taken care of. Not having match secured. And lastly, Lack of consistency between the budget, site plan, and scope of work. For example, if the scope says ADA parking will be provided, does the budget reflect costs of constructing ADA parking spaces? So here is the trail development process as we just went through. An additional grant opportunity outside of the typical trail development process we just discussed is that of equipment purchase. Trail equipment purchase projects include the purchase or lease of equipment for maintenance or construction of motorized and non-motorized trails. Trail equipment purchases can only be funded with Pennsylvania Recreational Trails funding or the ATV and Snowmobile Management Restricted Accounts, which we will go over in a bit. You should apply for a trail equipment purchase project if you maintain enough miles of trails to justify a dedicated piece of equipment to only trails and trail facilities. Have the staff, volunteers, or club members with the skills necessary to operate the equipment. Finally, is the trail or trail facilities open to the public? Generally, DCNR does not fund members-only clubs. Here are some things to consider before applying. Equipment can only be used for trails or trail facilities. For example, it cannot be used for maintenance and construction of other types of recreation facilities, public roads, or non-publicly accessible properties. The applicant must be prepared to maintain and care for the equipment long-term. Successful grantees must provide a status report to DCNR every 2 years. DCNR permission is needed before any equipment can be sold or disposed of. Applicants should also expect to use an open and competitive process to find and purchase any equipment. Here are a few common issues we see with trail equipment purchase applications. Must have a cash match. Non-cash match is not eligible. Applicants must use realistic price quotes to establish grant requests. This will take a little bit of research on the part of the applicant to establish a realistic price for the type of equipment they'd like to purchase. We're going to take a moment here to talk about motorized recreation projects. DCNR does have dedicated funding sources for motorized recreation. Generally, those funds can pay for planning, land acquisition, design, development, rehabilitation, and maintenance, as well as equipment purchase for motorized recreation. The first grant opportunity is motorized. This is a federal source of funding that can pay for development, rehabilitation, and maintenance of motorized trails, as well as the purchase of equipment to maintain and construct those trails. Secondly, we have the ATV and Snowmobile Management Restricted Accounts. Those funds can only be used for projects that support ATVing and snowmobiling. We have 2 grant rounds a year for those funds. We will go over those funds in a little more detail in a moment. Generally, to receive funding for the development or acquisition of motorized facilities, you will first need to have a written plan in place, and this is something that DCNR can help to fund. Now that we've gone through the various grant opportunities for trails, we're going to talk a little bit about accessibility requirements, which will help you scope your projects appropriately. Accessibility is an important element of any trail project, yet is often misunderstood. When designing and developing a trail, it's important to remember that a trail is a public facility and must comply with the appropriate ADA and accessibility standards. So to begin this discussion, we're going to start off with trails and the definition of trails related to accessibility standards. And that definition is new or altered trails that are designed for hiker or pedestrian use and that connects either directly to a trailhead or to another trail. That is the definition for what is considered a trail for accessibility reasons. The standards for trails are covered in the Trails for All People Manual and is based on the federal guidelines for outdoor developed areas. You can get a copy of it on conservationtools.org and by searching for Trails for All People. The manual discusses requirements for trail surface, running slopes, cross slopes, signage, and potential exemptions to these requirements. While we will not cover all the requirements for trails in this presentation, we do have an illustration here of a trail that is considered accessible. The surface is firm and stable, and the running slope is relatively low. On the left is a photo of a sign posted at a trailhead for a hiking trail. You can tell that the hiking trail is a relatively difficult trail and does not generally meet accessibility requirements. However, this sign was provided at the trailhead to let users know what they're going to encounter on the trail and to then allow them to make their own decision on whether to proceed. This is something that would be discussed in the Trails for All People manual. Next, we're going to discuss shared use paths. Shared use paths are multi-use paths designed primarily for use by bicyclists and pedestrians, including pedestrians with disabilities, for transportation and recreation purposes. These paths typically have a machined, layered surface, like asphalt or concrete or some other bonded material, and are located in either an independent corridor or a public right-of-way. Trails that fall under the definition of a shared use path will follow the public rights-of-way accessibility guidelines, which are now law under the ADA. These requirements must be met regardless of funding source. Before we move on, notice we've only talked about pedestrian and hiking trails, and now bicycle pedestrian trails. Trails that are specifically designed for other uses, such as mountain biking, equestrian, or ATVing, are not required to comply with the technical requirements that we just went over. In other words, there are no technical standards for those types of trails. Outside of the design requirements for trails and shared use paths, we also have support facilities and features along most trails, and those features and facilities are generally covered under the 2010 ADA standards. Examples of facilities would be parking areas, restrooms, benches, etc. So this slide really helps highlight the importance of understanding accessibility requirements when it comes to trail support facilities. This is a photo of a parking area at a trailhead along a hiking trail. And here you can see that there is concrete for the parking area and a concrete aisle and a way to get over to the restroom facilities. Generally meets the 2010 standards. There's a few minor issues, including the signs not being the correct signs, and there is an issue with the transition between the concrete and the stone for the rest of the parking area. However, what we're really trying to illustrate with this photo is if you are going to build a trail and rehabilitate or build a new parking area, you must understand that you do need to provide accessible parking and accessible features. And that's important for budgeting and for scoping your project properly. Moving on from accessibility, we're going to wrap this up by going over our funding sources. Through our grant program, we have several funding sources for trail projects. Number one is our Keystone Recreation Park and Conservation Fund, which is our primary funding source. Requires a 50-50 match. Government entities are eligible, meaning municipalities, counties, and authorities. The project types that are eligible are development, planning, and land acquisition. This is the bulk of our funding. Environmental Stewardship Fund is very limited, also a 50-50 match, and it's also one of the funding sources that we have available for non-municipal entities like nonprofit organizations. The projects it can fund include development, planning, and land acquisition. Next, we have the Pennsylvania Recreational Trails Fund, which is an 80-20 match, meaning 80% grant and 20% match. It is a federal source of funding, which means it comes with federal strings. So there are additional approvals and requirements during the life of the project. Most entities are eligible for this fund, and we can fund both non-motorized and motorized trail projects. This funding only accounts for about 15 to 20% of our total trail budget. Project types include development, rehabilitation, and maintenance, and equipment purchases. Finally, we have our ATV and snowmobile fund. Funding comes from ATV and snowmobile registrations. No match requirement for this fund. We have 2 grant rounds per year, one in the spring and one in fall. And the project types that are eligible are land acquisition, planning, development, rehabilitation, maintenance, equipment purchase, and educational programs. As mentioned several times during this presentation, it is important to connect with your regional advisor as early as possible to discuss your project. Here we have a map and contact information of all of our regional advisors across the state. Thank you for listening to the Trail Breakout session, and good luck with your funding application.